the scuff on his dancing shoe. The left one was the exact shade of the wine stain spreading on the hem of her ivory dress. In the shimmering light of the crystal chandeliers, that small imperfection seemed louder than the orchestra playing somewhere in the distance. The year was 1938. The month October. Vienna's Grand Imperial Ballroom had been transformed into something it was never meant to be. Elara held her breath as the German officer spun her across the polished floor. His grip was too tight on her waist, his cologne thick and suffocating like the flowers they piled on graves. She counted the seconds in her head, the way she used to count dance steps as a girl. 1, 2, 3. If she'd focused on the numbers, she could pretend her hand wasn't being held quite so firmly. She could pretend the man smiling at her wasn't wearing the uniform of those who had taken her husband 6 months ago. Around them, Vienna's elites swirled in their own private performances. The ballroom ceiling displayed paintings of angels reaching toward heaven, but down here, everyone was striking their own careful bargains with a world that had suddenly turned dangerous. The older women watched from velvet chairs along the walls, their fans moving slowly, their eyes missing nothing. The younger ones danced because refusing to dance was no longer an option. From somewhere near the tall windows, Leo watched. He stood with his back to the night, one shoulder, against the heavy drapes that smelled of dust and older, happier times. His uniform felt stiff in ways that had nothing to do with the fabric. 27 years old, captain in the Abwehr, and assigned to monitor gatherings like this one. His job was to watch for the small signs of defiance, the whispered jokes, the couples who lingered too long in corridors. He was good at his job because he had learned to read people the way his mother used to read tea leaves. But tonight, his eyes kept returning to the woman in the ivory dress. He noticed the way her smile never reached her eyes. He noticed the officer's thumb pressing just a little too hard against her back. Holiday. He noticed the slight tremble in her shoulders when the music slowed and the officer leaned closer to speak against her ear. Leo's hand tightened on his champagne glass, the stem warm from his palm. He had no reason to intervene. He had every reason to stay exactly where he was, watching, recording, surviving. His brother had written from Berlin just last week. Keep your head down, the letter had said. This will pass. Won't, Leo had thought, but he had written back anyway. And keeping my head down. The music shifted into a new waltz, something slow and aching. The officer showed no signs of returning Elara to her aunt, who sat near the fountain with worry carved into every line of her face. Elara's neck was beginning to flush red where the officer's breath kept landing. Later, Leo would never be able to explain what made him move. Perhaps it was the memory of his sister, before she married and moved away. Perhaps it was simply that he had spent so many months watching, and watching was not the same as living. Set his champagne glass on a passing tray and walked across the floor. The other officers noticed immediately. Heads turned, conversations paused. Leo was known as the quiet one, the careful one, the one who never made waves. So, when he approached the dancing couple and placed a firm hand on the officer's shoulder, the room seemed to hold its breath. The officer turned, irritation flashing across his features. But Leo was taller, and his rank was equal, and there were protocols for these things. The colonel requests your presence, Leo said smoothly, nodding toward a cluster of senior officers near the orchestra. Who's asking about the transport schedules? I said I'd find you. The officer hesitated, his grip on Elara loosening. He looked at her once more, then at Leo, then back at the colonel. With a curt nod, he released her completely and strode away across the floor. And then it was just the two of them, standing in the middle of the ballroom with the music still playing and all those eyes still watching. Leo extended his hand. He didn't smile, didn't speak, simply held out his palm and waited. Elara looked at his hand. Shu looked at his face. She noticed the slight scuff on his left shoe, the kind of scuff that came from walking city streets rather than gliding across ballroom floors. She noticed the way his eyes held steady, not demanding, not assuming, just offering. She placed her hand in his, the waltz wrapped around them like something from another life. He led with quiet confidence, his steps precise without being showy. She followed, her body remembering what her heart had forgotten, The simple pleasure of moving in time with another person. V didn't speak. They didn't need to. The dance said everything that couldn't be said aloud in that room full of uniforms and careful smiles. For 3 minutes and 47 seconds, Elara was not a widow. She was not a target. She was simply a woman dancing with a man who held her as though she mattered. When the music ended, Leo released her immediately and stepped back. He offered a small bow, correct and formal. Then, he extended his arm toward her aunt, who had risen from her chair and was making her way slowly across the floor. Lara took her aunt's arm, and together they moved toward the exit dot at the doorway. Elara paused. She turned to look back. Leo was still standing where she had left him, his hands now clasped behind his back, his eyes following her. In the candlelight, his expression was impossible to read. But he didn't look away, and neither did she. The moment stretched. Someone laughed nearby. A waiter passed with a tray of empty glasses. The orchestra began another song. Elara turned and walked through the doors, her aunt's hand warm on her arm. The last thing she saw was the chandelier reflecting in the tall windows, and beneath it, the silhouette of a man who had just done something he could not explain and could never undo. Later, slipping through a narrow corridor to avoid the main staircase, Lara rounded a corner and walked straight into someone's solid, strong hands caught her elbows, steadying her before she could fall. It was him, up close. She could see the tiredness around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he looked past her down the hallway. He released her quickly, stepping back. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. Leave through the kitchen. Now. She stared at him. Why? He didn't answer. Holiday. His eyes flicked toward the end of the corridor, where heavy footsteps were approaching. Officer from before, his voice raised, asking someone which way the little traitor's widow had gone. Leo stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the sound. Holiday. He raised his voice just enough to be heard. Saw no one, sir. The corridor is empty. The footsteps paused. Then, slowly, they retreated. Elara stood frozen in the shadows, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked at Leo's back, at the way his shoulders held tension despite his calm voice, at the uniform he wore that marked him as one of them. He turned to face her. In the dim light, his expression was unreadable, but his voice, when he spoke, was soft. Go now, quickly. She went, through the kitchen, past the startled cooks, out into the cold October night, where her aunt waited by the fountain. She didn't look back, but she carried with her the memory of his hands steadying her, his voice lying for her, and the impossible question that would follow her through the coming years. Who was this man who danced like an angel and wore the uniform of devils? 2 weeks had passed since the ball, and Vienna had settled into a cold, grey October. Rain fell each morning, leaving the cobblestones slick and treacherous. Lara pulled her coat tighter as she hurried along Spiegelgasse, her breath forming small clouds that disappeared almost instantly. In her pocket, her fingers wrapped around the only thing of value she had left. The bookshop on Weibergus was small and easy to miss. Its windows were cluttered with faded spines and yellowed pages, the kind of place where people went when they wanted to be invisible. Elara pushed open the door and a small bell chimed somewhere in the back. The smell hit her first. Old paper, binding glue, the faint mustiness of stories waiting to be read. It reminded her of her father's study, before the war, before everything changed. She stood for a moment, letting the memory wash over her. Behind the counter, an old man with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from his newspaper. Hollered. He nodded once and returned to reading. Scowls. In Vienna these days, strangers did not exchange pleasantries. It was safer that way. Elara walked slowly between the shelves, running her fingers along the spines. She wasn't really looking. She was waiting for the other customers to leave, for the moment when she could speak to the old man privately. A young woman in a blue coat was browsing near the poetry section. A priest examined a collection of religious texts near the window. Lara waited. When the young woman finally left, bell chiming behind her, Elara approached the counter. She pulled the first edition from her pocket. Goethe, 1827. with the original binding still intact. Her husband had given it to her on their first anniversary. She placed it on the counter and watched the old man's eyes widen slightly behind his glasses. He picked it up carefully. Turning it over in his hands, his fingers traced the spine, the corners, the gilded edges of the pages. "Bees is a beautiful thing," he said quietly. "Where did you get it?" "Doesn't matter. See." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. 40 is all I can give. 2. It was less than half of what it was worth. It was also more money than Elara had seen in months. She nodded. The old man reached under the counter for a metal box. He turned the combination lock, opened it, and began counting out bills. Elara watched his hands, the way they trembled slightly with age. Behind her, the bell chimed again. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the money, on the old man's hands, on anything except whoever had just walked through the door. The priest, she thought. Probably the priest coming back for something. But the footsteps stopped directly behind her. Not the soft shuffle of an old man in worn shoes. Something else. Steady, deliberate, military. "Leave the book on the counter," a low voice said, "and step outside with me." Elara's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. She'd heard it whisper lies to save her in a darkened corridor. Slowly, she turned. Leo stood 2 feet away, out of uniform for the first time. He wore a simple grey coat, a dark scarf wrapped around his neck, civilian shoes that looked almost new. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the shop, the windows, the old man behind the counter. "Please," he said, and the word was soft, not an order. "Requests." The old man looked from Elara to Leo and back again. Slowly, he withdrew his hands from the metal box and folded them on the counter. Waiting, Elara didn't move. "Why Leo's jaw tightened. "Holiday." He glanced toward the window, where the priest had finally left and the street was momentarily empty. Then, he looked back at her, and for just a second, the mask slipped. She saw something underneath. Worry, fear, the same exhaustion she saw in her own mirror each morning. "Because your name is on a list," he said quietly. "Numb, the only one who knows." The bookshop seemed to shrink around her. The smell of old paper suddenly felt suffocating. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening against the dark wood. What list? The list of widows whose husbands served in the previous government. The list of families who haven't been seen at the right events. List of people who will receive visits in the night. He took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the rain on his coat. "They're going to come for you, Elara. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, but they're coming." She wanted to ask how he knew her name. She wanted to ask why he cared. She wanted to ask 100 questions. But her voice had disappeared somewhere into the hollow space in her chest. Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He placed it on the counter next to the goods. Inside is an identity card, a train ticket to Paris, and enough money for 3 months if you're careful. Elara stared at the envelope. She didn't touch it. 2. "Why are you doing this?" She didn't answer immediately. Behind them, the bell chimed again, and this time it was the priest, finally leaving with his books. Leo waited until the door closed before speaking. "My brother," he said quietly. "His name is Leo. He's 2 years younger than me. We look enough alike that the photograph on the card will pass inspection if you don't draw attention to yourself." He paused. "You're my sister now. On paper, Elara Schmidt. Schmidt is family name. She would carry it across borders, through train stations, past checkpoints. She would be bound to him by a lie, more intimate than any truth they might ever speak. "You're asking me to trust you," she said. "Otto, I don't know you, Sure. You know I lied for you in that corridor. 2. You know I danced with you when everyone was watching. You know I'm standing here now, in civilian clothes, giving you a way out when I should be filing reports about suspicious activity in bookshops." He met her eyes and held them. "That's more than most people in this city have right now." The old man behind the counter cleared his throat softly. He pushed the 40 shillings across the counter toward Elara. "Take the money," he said quietly. "Take the envelope. And go while you still can." Elara looked at the money, a P at the envelope, the Goethe, still sitting on the counter, her husband's gift, her last connection to a life that no longer existed. She couldn't take it with her. Books were heavy. Books drew attention. Books got people killed. She picked up the envelope first, tucking it into her coat pocket, then the money. Then, slowly, she pushed the Goethe back toward the old man. "For your shelf," she said. "Keep it safe." The old man nodded, his eyes bright behind his glasses. Hugh took the book and placed it carefully on the shelf behind him, next to a worn Bible and a collection of German poetry. Leo touched her elbow lightly. "We need to go. There's a train at 4. I'll walk you to the station." "What about my aunt?" Stopped. Hugh saw something flicker across his face. There and gone too fast to read. "Where does she live?" "7th District, near the..." Leo glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:15. "We've time. We'll get her first." They left the bookshop together, walking close, but not touching. Bet. The rain had stopped, but the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of wet stone and chimney smoke through the narrow streets. Laura kept her head down, her hand in her pocket wrapped around the envelope. They walked in silence. Swalk was there to say. She was a German captain walking through Vienna with a Jewish widow, headed to collect her elderly aunt before fleeing to a train station. In any other time, in any other place, this might have been the beginning of something. Tear. And now, it was simply survival. Her aunt's building stood on a quiet street near the theater. 5 stories of faded elegance with Rottian balconies and a heavy wooden door. Elara pushed it open and started up the stairs, Leo close behind her. The door to apartment 3B was ajar. Elara stopped. Her heart, which had been beating steadily since the bookshop, suddenly forgot its rhythm. Hugh reached out and pushed the door gently with one finger. It swung open. The smell hit her first. Perfume, overturned and spreading across a wooden dresser. Something burning, or burned. The sharp, acrid scent of paper reduced to ash. She stepped inside. The apartment had been torn apart, drawers pulled out and dumped on the floor, cushions sliced open, their stuffing scattered like snow, books thrown from shelves, their spines broken. In the center of it all, on the small table where her aunt took her morning coffee, a single object. A dancing shoe. Ivory satin, scuffed at the toe. The one she had worn at the ball. Elara picked it up with trembling hands. It was hers. She remembered the tightness across the toes, the way her aunt had helped her fasten the tiny buttons that night. She remembered standing in this very apartment, turning this way and that, asking if she looked presentable. Behind her, Leo moved through the rooms quickly, quietly. She'd heard him open a closet, check the kitchen, look out the back window toward the courtyard. When he returned, his face was pale. "They're gone," he said quietly. Her aunt, too. Whoever did this, they're both gone. Elara clutched the shoe to her chest. She thought of her aunt's hands, knotted with age, always reaching for her own. She thought of the way she hummed old Viennese songs while she cooked. She thought of the last time she saw her, standing in this doorway, saying, "Be careful. Come home soon." She looked at Leo, standing among the wreckage in his civilian clothes. The man who had danced with her, lied for her, found her in a bookshop to save her. A P at the uniform he wasn't wearing, the rank he was risking, the life he was throwing away for reasons she still didn't understand. That night at the ball, she had thought it was a moment of grace, a single perfect waltz in a world gone wrong. Now, holding her aunt's empty shoe, she understood. It wasn't a moment of grace at all. It was the first step in a dance of destruction. By stepping onto the floor with her, was now bound to her until the music stopped. Winter had painted the mountains white by the time they reached the safe house. December 1940. 2 years since the ball, 2 years of train stations and false papers, of borrowed names and borrowed time. They had fled Vienna together, then Paris just ahead of the occupation, moving, always east toward the border, toward somewhere safer that never quite arrived. The house sat alone on a hillside overlooking a valley that belonged to Switzerland, if you walked far enough. Rooms, a kitchen with a wood stove, windows that rattled when the wind came down from the peaks. It had belonged to a farmer who left when the fighting started, and now it belonged to no one, which meant it belonged to them. Elara stood at the kitchen window watching snow collect on the glass. Outside, the world had gone silent and white. Sipped inside, the clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking time that felt both endless and too fast. 2 years of sharing a single room. 2 years of learning the sound of his breathing while he slept. 2 years of pretending not to notice the way her heart shifted whenever he walked through the door. She heard him moving in the other room now. The familiar sounds of morning, water pouring into the basin, the scrape of a razor against leather. She had memorized these sounds the way she once memorized piano, each one falling into place to create something larger than itself. He appeared in the doorway with his back to her, standing before the small mirror they had hung on the wall. The shirt was open at the collar, suspenders hanging loose at his waist. He lifted the straight razor to his jaw and drew it slowly down his cheek. Elara should have looked away. She knew she should have looked away, but her eyes stayed fixed on the shape of his shoulders, the way the muscles moved beneath his skin, the vulnerable curve of his neck as he tilted his head to reach a difficult spot. She had seen him 1,000 times. She had never seen him like this. 2 years of running had stripped away everything unnecessary. The uniforms were gone, burned in a field outside Lyon. The ranks and titles meant nothing here. He was just a man now, a man with tired eyes and steady hands, and a way of looking at her that made her forget, sometimes, why they couldn't have more than this. He caught her reflection in the mirror. Their eyes met through the glass. He didn't turn around. She just stopped moving, the razor frozen halfway down his jaw, a tiny bead of blood appearing where the blade had pressed too long. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Then he spoke, his voice rough from sleep and something else she couldn't name. We can't. Elara, you know this. He didn't mean the staring. He meant everything, too. The way she waited for him to come back from checking the perimeter, the way he saved the warmest blanket for her bed, too. The way they sat closer than necessary by the fire each night, pretending the cold required it. Elara looked away first. She turned back to the window, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. Her heart beating so loud she was certain he could hear it across the room, too. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and indifferent to the small human drama playing out behind the glass. That night, they ate dinner without speaking, potatoes and dried meat, the same meal they had eaten for weeks. The fire crackled in the stove, casting shadows across the walls. Leo stared into his plate. Elara stared at the flames. She thought about her aunt, gone 2 years now, probably gone forever. She thought about the dancing shoe she had found in the wreckage of that apartment, the one she still carried in her bag for reasons she couldn't explain. She thought about the life she had left behind, the woman she used to be, the person she had become. In the mirror that morning, she had seen something new in her own reflection. Not just exhaustion, not just fear, something else, a kind of wanting that had no place in a world like this. She looked at Leo across the table, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago, at the way his hands held his fork like a weapon he might need to use, then at the tiny cut on his jaw where the razor had drawn blood. He loved her. She knew this the same way she knew winter would eventually end. The same way she knew the sun would rise each morning behind the mountains, too. It was simply there, as real and solid as the walls around them, and it changed nothing, because love in this place, in this time, was not a comfort. 2. It was a danger. There was one more thing that could be used against them. One more weakness that could get them caught. One more reason to make mistakes. 50. Every glance they stole, every moment they lingered too close, every unspoken word between them was a thread that could unravel everything. After dinner, he went outside to check the woodpile. Shu watched him through the window, his breath clouding in the cold, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He moved carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything now. 2 years of running had taught them both to never rush, never draw attention, never do anything that might leave tracks. When he came back inside, his cheeks were flushed with cold. Set more wood by the stove, then stood with his back to her, warming his hands over the flames. I have to go back, he said quietly. The words didn't make sense at first, showed him, but they refused to arrange themselves into meaning. What? He turned to face her. Expression was calm, but she had learned to read the small signs. The tightness at the corner of his mouth. Dewey's hands hung at his sides instead of crossing his chest. He was terrified. A message came through the drop-in burn. They're recalling me. My commanding officer wants to see me in Vienna. You can't go back. They'll know you ran. They'll suspect, but they won't know. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his coat. I'm still a captain in the Abwehr. On paper, I've been gathering intelligence in France. They have no proof otherwise. If I don't go, they'll come looking. They'll find this house. They'll find you. I don't care about me. I do. The words hung between them, heavy as the snow outside. He had never said it before, not once. In 2 years, had he spoken those words aloud. V stood in the small kitchen, with the fire crackling and the wind moaning against the windows, and everything had changed without anything moving at all. Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them, the address of the drop-in burn. If you need me, leave a message there. I'll check it when I can, when you can. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat, empty, and if you can't, he'd an answer. He'd need to. That night, she lay awake listening to him pack, the soft thump of his bag on the floor, the rustle of clothing, the click of the latch. Sound was a small death. Another piece of him disappearing into the darkness. In the morning, he was gone. She woke to an empty room, the fire already banked, a pot of coffee keeping warm on the stove. His blankets were folded neatly at the foot of his bed, the way his mother must have taught him. For, on the pillow, he had left something small, a photograph, black and white, creased at the edges. It showed a young man in a captain's uniform, standing stiffly in front of a Viennese palace, Hollerhead himself. 2 years ago, VP before the ball, before her, before everything. On the back, in handwriting she had never seen before. For when you forget my face, she held the photograph to her chest and sat on his empty bed, surrounded by the smell of him that would fade in days. Tide. The snow had stopped. Beer. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere out there, Hawes. He was walking toward a train that would take him back into the heart of everything they had fled. And then Elara realized something that stopped her breath. His protection had never been freedom. It had only ever been a different kind of cage, a beautiful cage, built of sacrifice and silence and unspoken words, but a cage nonetheless. And now the door was open. She had never felt more trapped in her entire life. The train pulled into Vienna's West Force. On a grey morning in September 1944, Elara stepped onto the platform, wearing a plain brown dress and a scarf that covered most of her hair. 4 years had passed since she last saw this city. For years, since she fled with a dead man's name and a dancing shoe in her bag. The station swarmed with uniforms, soldiers heading east, wounded returning west, officers with clipboards and cold eyes. Elara moved through them like water around stones, her head down, her steps steady. She carried a small suitcase filled with nothing that could get her killed. Her real cargo was in her memory, names and dates and routes, information that would pass through her hands and on to others who needed it more. She was a courier now, too. The resistance had found her in the mountains, or she had found them. It was hard to say which. Spore. What mattered was that the woman who left Vienna in fear had returned in purpose. Her love for Leo, the longing that had once felt like a cage, had become something else entirely. Fueled her now. It made her brave when bravery made no sense. It made her walk through train stations filled with the enemy and feel nothing but the steady beat of her own heart. The cafés had changed. Block bomb craters dotted the streets. Buildings that once housed families now stood hollow and broken, their windows like empty eyes staring at the sky. Vienna was starving, freezing, dying by inches, and somewhere in this wounded city, Leo was still alive. Shed made sure of that. The messages she left in Bern always reached him. His replies, brief and coded, always reached her back. He was still a captain, still walking the halls of power, still wearing the uniform he hated, still feeding information to people who would never know his name, and still, after all these years, still hers, in every way that mattered except the one. She found him at the cafe on the corner of Praterstrasse, the one they had used once before, years ago, when the world was different, stood, half destroyed like everything else, its front wall patched with boards, its windows covered in tape to stop them shattering during air raids. A handwritten sign in the door said, "Open," as if anyone had anywhere to go. He sat at a table near the back, his back to the wall, his eyes on the door. When she walked in, something shifted in his face. Relief, fear, love, all of it, there, and gone in a second. Hidden behind the mask he had worn for so long it had probably become his skin. She sat across from him without speaking. A waiter appeared, an old man with shaking hands, and they ordered coffee that would arrive weak and bitter and taste like heaven anyway. Leo looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't been able to look in that mountain house 4 years ago. She had changed. The softness was gone from her face, replaced by something sharp and focused. Her hands, once so still, now moved with the restless energy of someone always watching, always waiting. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "I know, it's too dangerous. Biggs, if anyone sees us together, no one will see us." She leaned forward, close enough to smell him, the same smell she had carried in her memory through all those years. "I need your help." His eyes narrowed. "What kind of help?" "Transport routes. There's a prisoner convoy leaving next week. 47 people, including 3 we can't afford to lose." She watched his face, licking, for the moment when he would refuse, when he would tell her it was impossible, when he would try to protect her. One more time it came. She saw it. In the tightening of his jaw, the way his hands flattened on the table. "Elara, no, this is too far. I'm caught. If you're caught, you're caught. If they're caught, they're dead. I'm not talking about me." His voice dropped even lower, barely a whisper. "I'm talking about you, thing. They'll just send you to a camp. Do you think they'll be kind? You have no idea what they do to women like you." She had heard this before. The protective tone, the careful warnings, the way he always positioned himself between her and the world. It had touched her once. Now, it just made her tired. "I know exactly what they do," she said quietly. "I've buried 15 people this year. I've held their hands while they died. I've carried their last words to families who will never hear them." She paused. "To tell me what I don't know." He stared at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe creaked around them, the old wood settling, the tape on the windows fluttering in a draft. "Leo," she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Skin was warm, the bones sharp beneath. "Didn't come here to be saved. I came here because you're the only person in this city who can get me what I need. Twally, the only person I trust." He looked at their hands, his, covering hers now, the way it had covered hers in that corridor so many years ago. Thor. The world had turned upside down since then. Everything had changed except this. "The files are in my office," he said slowly. "3rd floor, East Wing, guarded day and night. I know you know." He almost smiled. "Of course, you know. I need the transport numbers, the dates, the routes they're taking, tour, anything that will help us find them before they disappear." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a military truck rumbled past, its engine straining. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began to wail, then stopped. "Leo," she squeezed his hand. "Look at me." He looked. "I have spent 4 years loving you from a distance. 4 years carrying your photograph in my pocket and your name in my heart. Ty, I have done everything you asked. I have stayed hidden. I have stayed quiet. I have stayed alive." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "Now, I'm asking you to do something for me. Not for the resistance. Not for the prisoners. For me." His hand tightened on hers. "You don't understand, Thigh. If I do this, if I'm caught, then die giving me something, not nothing." The words hung between them like a challenge, like a gift, like the thing she had wanted to say for 4 years, but never had the courage to speak. Leo's eyes widened. Then, slowly, Something shifted in his face. Fear didn't disappear, but it moved aside, making room for something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition. The look of a man seeing, for the first time, the woman he loved as she truly was. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled cigarette packet. Score. Empty. The brand faded, the cardboard soft from being carried too long. Turned it over in his hands, then looked around the cafe. Too. The old waiter had disappeared into the back. The other tables were empty. No one watched. With a burnt matchstick from the ashtray, he began to write. Small numbers, cramped together, covering every inch of the inside of the packet. Transport numbers, dates, routes, names of officers who could be bribed. Crossroads, where guards could be distracted. The exact schedule of the convoy that would carry 47 people toward their deaths. When he finished, T pressed the packet into her palm and closed her fingers around it. Don't open it here, he said quietly. Memorize it tonight. Burn it tomorrow. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He stood. For a moment, he looked down at her. This woman who had walked back into his life and turned it upside down. This woman who had loved him from a distance for 4 years and never once asked for anything in return until now. Elara. She looked up. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everything he couldn't say was written in his eyes, in the slight tremor of his hands. In a way, he stood so close she could feel the warmth of him through the cold air between them. Then he turned and walked away. She watched him go, his uniform blending with the grey of the ruined street, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared around a corner. In her hand, the cigarette packet felt impossibly heavy, weighted with all the years and all the choices and all the love. They had never spoken aloud. She sat for a long time in the empty cafe, the coffee growing cold in front of her. Then, she stood, tucked the packet into the safest pocket she had, and walked out into the Vienna afternoon. The street was quiet, too quiet. At the end of the block, a military jeep rounded the corner, its engine the only sound in the stillness. Its headlights cut through the grey light, catching her figure as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The brakes screamed. The sound cut through everything. Through the silence, through the years, through the small hope that had flickered to life in her chest when Leo pressed that packet into her hand. Elara turned toward the sound, and the world stopped. Spring arrived, late in 1945, as if the city itself was hesitant to believe the war had finally ended. Vienna emerged from winter like a patient waking from a long illness, weak and changed and unsure of what came next. The bombs had stopped falling in April. By May, the silence felt almost louder than the sirens ever had. Elara walked through streets she barely recognized. The Appenring was a graveyard of stone and twisted metal. The great buildings she remembered from childhood stood hollow and broken, their facades pockmarked with bullet holes, their insides open to the sky. She stepped around rubble and over fallen wires, her shoes leaving prints in the dust that covered everything. 7 years since the ball. 7 years since a stranger in a captain's uniform had cut in and changed everything. She was 31 now. Her hair had grayed at the temples. Her hands, once so soft, were rough and scarred from work she had never imagined doing. But she was alive. That alone felt like a kind of victory. She had made it out of Vienna that day in September. The jeep that screamed to a stop had been checking papers, nothing more. A young soldier with tired eyes had looked at her documents, handed them back, waved her on. She had walked away with her heart pounding and the cigarette packet burning against her skin. And she had not stopped walking until she crossed the border into Switzerland 3 weeks later. The information Leo gave her saved 43 of those 47 prisoners. She knew this because the resistance told her, because the names appeared on lists posted in safe houses, because 3 of them found her after the war to say thank you. 43 lives, 43 families who would sit down to dinner again. Because a man in a cafe wrote numbers on a crumpled cigarette packet with a burnt matchstick. She never heard from him after that day. The drop in Bern went silent. The messages she left received no replies. She told herself, this was good. This was safe. This meant he had survived and gone underground and would find her when he could. She told herself this for months. She almost believed it. Now she stood at the edge of what used to be the Imperial Ballroom. The building had taken a direct hit sometime in the final weeks. The roof was gone, collapsed inward, leaving only the outer walls standing against the sky. Chunks of marble lay scattered across what had once been the dance floor. A chandelier lay on its side in the rubble, its crystals dull with dust. Catching the weak spring sunlight like tears, Elara stepped carefully through the wreckage. Her boots crunched on broken glass and plaster. Somewhere above, a bird sang, indifferent to the destruction below. She moved toward the place where the fountain used to stand, where her aunt had waited that night so long ago. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but closure, maybe, or proof that any of it had been real. The war had taken so much, erased so many memories, that sometimes she wondered if the ball had happened at all. The waltz had been real, if the man with the scuffed shoes had ever existed outside her imagination. Her foot caught on something half buried in the rubble. She looked down, reached into the debris, pulled free a single dancing shoe. Ivory satin, now grey with dust and water stains, scuffed at the toe. The heel was broken, the sole nearly detached. 'Twas not her shoe. It was not the shoe she had found in her aunt's apartment. It was just a shoe, one of hundreds that must have been worn in this room over the years. But it was the exact same shade, the exact same shape, the exact same scuff mark on the left toe. She held it in both hands, turning it over, running her thumb across the ruined satin. The birds sang on. Stein. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky. Somewhere in the city, life was beginning again. People rebuilding. Children playing in streets that had known only fear for so long. Behind her, gravel crunched. She didn't turn. She knew the rhythm of that walk. She'd listened to it for 2 years in a mountain safe house. Memorized it the way other women memorized lullabies. Slower now. Uneven but unmistakably his. Leo stopped a few feet away. She turned slowly, the shoes still in her hands. There. He was thinner than she remembered, his face lined in ways that had nothing to do with age. Hugh wore a shabby civilian coat, too thin for the spring air, and leaned heavily on a wooden crutch, whose left leg ended just below the knee. The dancer's body was broken. Elara looked at the empty trouser leg, the crutch, Thor, at the way he held himself, shoulders squared despite everything. The same way he had held himself that first night, when he extended his hand across a ballroom floor. She looked at his face, at the eyes that had haunted her dreams for 7 years. He looked at the shoe in her hands, then at the ruin of the ballroom around them, then back at her. He shook his head, just barely, a tiny movement, the slightest shift from side to side, not refusal, not denial, wonder, maybe, at the cruelty of a world that would bring them back to this place. At the strange symmetry of ending where they began. She wanted to run to him. She wanted to throw her arms around him and never let go. She wanted to ask about the leg, about the years, about every moment they had spent apart. Schwanner, to tell him about the 43 prisoners, about the life she had built from the ashes, about the photograph she still carried in her pocket. She did none of these things. She held up the shoe instead, just slightly, just enough for him to see. He looked at it, then at her. And in his eyes, she saw everything. The same love that had burned in her all these years. The same loss, the seen, impossible hope that had kept them both alive when dying would have been easier. He had survived. She had survived. The dance was over. This was what remained. Elara bent down and placed the shoe carefully on a slab of fallen marble between them, offering a memorial, a goodbye, to everything that had been and everything that could never be. Then she straightened, took a breath, and stepped toward him. One step, just one. But it was everything. Leo watched her come. His hand tightened on the crutch. His jaw worked, muscles moving beneath the skin. But he didn't look away. He didn't retreat, simply waited. The way he had waited in that corridor so long ago. The way he had waited through years of silence and separation and war. She stopped when she was close enough to touch him, close enough to see the tears standing in his eyes, unshed but present. Close enough to feel the warmth of him despite the cold spring air. "You're alive," she said, her voice cracked on the second word. He nodded, swallowed. You too. I looked for you. After I left messages, I know. His voice was rough, unused to speaking. I couldn't answer. They had me in a hospital near Linz, then a prison camp. The Americans, not the Russians. Thank God they just released me last month. She reached out and touched his face. Her fingers traced the lines around his eyes, the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the small scar on his jaw where the razor had drawn blood that morning in the mountains. T closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into it like a man starved for warmth. I thought you were dead, she whispered. Every day. Every single day. I thought you were dead. I know. He opened his eyes. I thought the same about you. Around them, the ruined ballroom lay silent. The bird had stopped singing. The sun had moved behind a cloud, softening the light to grey. That neither of them noticed. They stood in the rubble of their past. Finally, close enough to touch after 7 years of distance, Leo reached out with his free hand and took hers. His fingers were cold, thinner than she remembered, but his grip was the same, steady, certain. The grip of a man who had held her once and never let go. Even when they were apart. I have nothing, he said quietly. No money. No home. No leg. He glanced down at himself, then back at her. I have nothing to offer you. Elara looked at him, death. At this man who had given her everything. Suit, who had risked his life to dance with her, to warn her, to save her. Sue had spent years feeding information to the resistance from inside the enemy's house, who had written numbers on a cigarette packet and doomed himself to save strangers. She squeezed his hand. You have you, she said. That's all I ever wanted. For a long moment, they stood there in the silence. Then, slowly, Leo smiled. It was small and uncertain. A smile that had forgotten how to smile. But it was real. It was Phil's. It was the first gift he had given her in this place, 7 years ago. And it was the gift he gave her now. Elara stepped closer still. She slipped her arm around his waist, taking some of his weight, letting him lean on her the way she had always wanted him to lean. Together, they turned and began to walk. The rubble crunched beneath their feet. The crutch tapped an uneven rhythm against the broken marble. It was not a waltz. It was not graceful, too. It was simply two people, moving forward, one step at a time. Behind them, the dancing shoe sat alone on its slab of stone, a small memorial to the night that started everything. But they didn't look back. They had spent 7 years looking back. It was time, finally, to see what lay ahead. The street outside was quiet. Few people moved in the distance, carrying bundles, going about the slow work of rebuilding. The air smelled of spring and dust, and the faint sweetness of flowers beginning to bloom in bombed out gardens. Leo stopped at the edge of the rubble and looked at her. Where do we go? He asked. Elara thought about it. The mountains. Maybe the safe house, if it still stood. Or somewhere new entirely. Somewhere without memories. Somewhere they could learn to be ordinary people living an ordinary life. She looked at the man beside her. At the crutch and the hollow cheeks and the eyes that held 7 years of love and loss and longing. At the hand that held hers like it would never let go. Forward, she said. We go forward. And they did.